Okay. உலகம் யாவையும் தாம் உள ஆக்கலும் நிலைபெறுத்தலும் நீக்கலும் நீங்களா அலகிலா விளையாட்டுடையார் அவர் தலைவர் அன்னவர்க்கே சரண் நாங்களே. என்னப்பன் எனக்காய்விடாய் என்னை பெற்றவளாய் பொன்னப்பன் மணியப்பன் முத்தப்பன் என்னப்பனுமாய் மின்னப்பொன் மதிழ் சூழ் திருவிண்ணகர் சேர்ந்தவப்பன் தன் ஒப்பார் இல்லாரப்பன் தந்தனன் தனதாழ் நிழலே. லக்ஷ்மீநாத சமாரம்பாம் நாத யாமுன மத்தியமாம் அஸ்மதாச்சாரிய பர்யந்தாம் வந்தே குரு பரம்பராம். உயர்வர உயர்நலம் உடையவன் எவனவன் மயர்வர மதிநலம் அருளினன் எவனவன் அயர்வரும் அமரர்கள் அதிபதி எவனவன் துயரறு சுடரடி தொழுதெழன் மனனே. So I know this first of the sessions does come at short notice, but one of the reasons I kind of still tried to set it up in haste is because today is the final Monday in a very holy month, especially this year because it is what we call as an Adhika Masa, and the final Somavara in the Adhika Masa is supposed to be one of the holiest days for Shiva. And because the stories that I intended to start off with relate to Shiva, I thought this would be a very, very auspicious date to coincide with our start of this journey as well. That being said, this is a new initiative or effort that I'm trying to make. I'm not sure about the output or the outcome of it, but if anything at all turns out good, it is purely that of Narayana, and all faults are purely mine. One of the most important works in Shaivism or Shivaite literature coming from the south of India, or perhaps from the whole of India, is this book called Periya Puranam. The Periya Puranam is one of the most celebrated, most revered works in Tamil literature. It was composed, or it was compiled rather, by a person called Sekkilhar. Sekkilhar is today considered a saint. He lived in Tamil Nadu in the 12th century, Common Era, and then he was a minister in the Chola kingdom, and he compiled the Periya Puranam. So today we will talk a little bit about Periya Puranam, its significance, its origins, some background story, and then we will pick up stories of about 5 important Nayanmars from within the Periya Puranam, and we'll look at their stories. First, the context. Sekkilhar, whose real name was Arulmozhi Thevan, he was a prime minister, not one of the ministers, but he was a prime minister in the court of the Chola king, Kolo Tunga Chola II. He was also called as Anabaya Chola. So in Tamil, he was called Anabaya Chola, but his formal name was Kolo Tunga Chola II. He was reigning the Chola land in the southern part of India. And during his time, there was a book that became popular, and that book was called Sivaga Chintamani. Now, Sivaga Chintamani was a romantic novel. Now, the king fell in love with the novel. He spent a lot of time studying it. And because the king started studying that, the entire population, the Chola kingdom, they started studying or reading the Sivaga Chintamani, which is a romance novel. Now, the prime minister at that time, who was Sekkilhar, felt the king and all the people in the kingdom sitting and spending their time and effort reading a novel, a romantic one at that, wasn't ideal for a kingdom. It wasn't beneficial for a kingdom. So he made the courage to stand up to the king. He went up to the king one day and said, "You have fallen passionately in love with this Sivaga Chintamani, and you are reading it all the time, and everybody is reading it. Being a king, it isn't very beneficial if you get stuck to reading a romantic novel. Instead, you should actually be, propagating bhakti. This is a land of Shiva. This is a land of Vishnu. There are Alvar saint poets. There were Nayanmar saint poets who have graced this land. Rather than studying about Bhakti and Shiva and the Nayanmars, why are you wasting time on such a novel? Now, the king in those days, first of all, the prime minister had the guts to stand up to the king and tell him what is good and what is not good. The second thing, the king was equally good to listen to the prime minister. It would have been very easy for him to dismiss away the suggestion. But the king was equally good to listen to the prime minister and said, okay, now that you have said Sivaka Sintamani is not a very beneficial novel, and you want me to study about the Nayanmar saints, the Shivaite saints of Tamil Nadu, tell me what is the novel that I can read. Where is the novel? Now, the prime minister said, I don't think there is a novel. There is a poem composed by a very great Saivite, one of the Nayanmars, 63. There are 63 Saivite Nayanmars in the Shiva tradition in Tamil Nadu. One of them is called Sundaramurthi Nayanar, Sundarar in short. So the minister says, Sundaramurthi Nayanar has sung one song which mentions all the Nayanmars. Now, there are no stories. I don't know if there are compiled stories of all the 63 Nayanmars, but there is one work of Sundaramurti that mentions these Nayanmars. Maybe we should start from there. Now, the king throws the challenge back at Sekkilhar and says, all good, all well and good, but I can't decode a poem. I want someone to compile it in the form of a novel, in the form of a book, and then you give it to me, and then I'll start reading it and I'll propagate dharma. So this is what Anabaya Chola or Kolo Tunga Chola, the second, challenges the prime minister with. Now the prime minister accepts this challenge. He tells Anabaya Chola, okay, if I have to go and work on this, it's a massive, daunting task. It's going to be very, very difficult, but I can still try and do it. If I have to do it, you need to do one thing, which is remove me from the prime ministership. I can't do this as a part-time job. Relieve me from the duties as the prime minister. I will spend the rest of my life trying to compile the stories of the Nayanmars. The king happily relieves him. Now, we have a daunting task in front of Sekkilhar, who doesn't know what to do. He straight away travels from the capital, the Chola capital, all the way to what is in Tamil called Thillai, or in English it is called Chidambaram. Chidambaram is one of the most sacred Shaivite temples in all of India, and much more in the southern part of India. Chidambaram, the Nataraja temple, in Shaivite tradition, when someone says, I'm going to a temple, when they say I'm going to a temple, mandir, devalaya, kovil, the word kovil in Tamil means temple. In the Shaivite tradition, if someone says I'm going to kovil, it by default means Chidambaram Nataraja Swami temple. There are a couple of very, very important or interesting facts about the Chidambaram Nataraja temple. In the Vaishnavite tradition, when they say kovil, it denotes the Srirangam Ranganatha Swami temple in Tiruchirappalli. Likewise, in the Shaivite tradition, the mere mention of temple means the Nataraja temple at Chidambaram, or in Tamil it's called Thillai. For another day, some other day, we'll look at the story of Thillai itself and how that temple came about and how Nataraja, Shiva as Nataraja, is in his eternal Ananda Thandava in that temple. That's for another day. But that temple has two very important features. One, Hindu religious tradition considers the place where the temple is located is the heart of the earth. It is the center of the earth. It is the center of the earth. And the second thing, what the Thillai temple also means is there are Pancha Bhuta temples. There are Shiva temples dedicated to the 5 Pancha Mahabhutas. This Nataraja temple is dedicated to one of the Pancha Mahabhutas, which is the Akasha. So Tiruvannamalai temple is an amsha of Shiva's Agni, fire. Likewise, this is Akasha. The Chidambaram Tillai Nataraja temple is a representation of Akasha among the Panchamahabhutas. So that is one relevance. And second is obviously it is considered the center of the earth, the heart of the earth by our religious tradition. Straight, Sekkilhar travels to Chidambaram, worships the Shiva Nataraja. He camps in the temple, just doing dhyana on Shiva and fervently praying and worshipping to Shiva. All that Sekkilhar has got is one poem which mentions the names of a list of Nayanmars. He's got that poem and he doesn't know anything. And that poem makes one word, one line, two-line references to each of these Nayanmars. It doesn't give their stories. In some cases, it doesn't even give their names. It just describes their attributes. He has a poem and the king has tasked him with writing a book explaining this poem. He believes it is impossible to write such a task unless Shiva himself comes. So he just is involved in deep bhakti, keeps praying to Shiva day and night at the Tillai Nataraja temple, the Chidambaram Nataraja temple. Finally, he gets the grace of Shiva, and Shiva, it seems the traditions goes, Shiva tells him that he will support him from behind. He can go and start writing the book. To which Sekkilhar rejects that and says, there is no way I can just do it with your support. I want you to do it for me. And Shiva says, okay, I will give you the first line or the first word of this book and start from there. And Shiva gives him the word Ulagelam. Ulagelam means all over the world, all across the world. So Ulagelam is the first word from which Sekkilhar starts writing. And since then, he just gets the stories in his mind, he decodes them, he does a lot of work, and he basically ends up writing or compiling this entire book. It is said it is Shiva who wrote it through Sekkilhar, and that compilation is today called as Periya Puranam. Now, what is this Periya Puranam all about? It talks about the stories of 63 revered holy saints in the Shaiva tradition called the Nayanmars. In the Vaishnava tradition, there are 12 saints who are celebrated, worshipped. They are called Alvars. In the Shaivite tradition, there are 63 celebrated poets and bhaktas who are called Nayanmars. Now, what is interesting about this Periya Puranam is this. It would have been very easy for Sekkilhar to take one story from those 63 and write an entire book about it. It would have still been of yeoman service to Shaivism. It would have still been an amazing book. But he doesn't just take one story and expand it into a book. He mentions and writes about all the 63 Nayanmars. It is a verse that is made up of 4,200. It is a book. It is a work that is made up of 4,253 verses. A single poem, which is about 10 paragraphs, becomes a work of 4,253 verses. That is the magic that the bhakti of Sekkilhar creates. Now, before we go into some of those stories and some more about Periya Puranam, we'll talk a little bit about Sundarar, who actually wrote those 10 paragraphs, who composed those 10 original paragraphs. Now, Sundaramurthi Nayanar or Sundarar is one of the 63 Nayanmars. The story is, there is an interesting bit of story of how Sundaramurthi Nayanar goes to the same Tillai Nataraja temple. And then in those days, there used to be a sabha. Just outside the Garbhagriha, there used to be a hall where there are Shaivite bhaktas sitting, and they all discuss Shaivism, Shiva, Bhakti, Jnana, Karma, Moksha. They always talk and discuss about Shiva. It happens that Sundarar once came to the Nataraja temple, and he was about to go and worship Shiva. And usually the practice is, in any Indian tradition, the Bhagavata or the Bhakta is as important as the Bhagavan. If you insult a Bhakta, you are insulting the Bhagavan. There is no point in seeking favors from Bhagavan at the expense of insulting the Bhakta. So the tradition is, whenever someone goes into the temple, they first bow, have a conversation with the Shivacharyas, the Bhaktas, and then they go and worship the Lord. Sundaramurthi Nayanar enters the temple. He sees all of them busy discussing between themselves or among themselves the stories of Shiva and Shiva Tattvas and whatnot. In order to not disturb them, Sundaramurthi Nayanar bows his head, straight away goes into the Garbhagriha. One person sees this and goes and complains to one of the leaders in that group, one of the elders in the group, who is known to be very, very short-tempered. I forget his name. I don't know the name now anyway. I can't recollect his name, but he goes and complains to that person. That person says, oh, it is okay. He might have not noticed it. That's fine. But the person is not happy. The guy who is complaining is not happy. He says, oh, how can Sundaramurti do this? How can he insult the Sabha? How can he insult all the scholars? And how can he go? Isn't it true that the Bhagavatas are as important as Bhagavan? So the leader gets, a little triggered by this, and he announces that Sundaramurti will be excommunicated from the Shaiva community for this fault. Now, the person who went with the complaint is not happy. Says, okay, you're excommunicated Sundaramurti, but what about Shiva, who permitted him to come into Garbhagriha despite the insult to all of his bhaktas? He is still not happy. So he raises the bar. He says, okay, you have punished him and excommunicated him. What about Shiva? Now, this leader says, oh yes, if Shiva has done this mistake, I also excommunicate Shiva from Shaivism. Now, as funny as this may sound, one of the things that we need to understand is Sanatana Dharma, Vaishnavism, Shaivism, Shaktism, the Hindu way of life or the Hindu religion. It gives us absolute freedom to question the Lord, so long as the questions are born out of legitimate understanding rather than kutarka, or just arguments for the sake of arguments. Ours is a dharma which has gone on or not hesitated to excommunicate Shiva from Shaivism because there is a genuine feeling of Shiva having broken a tradition. Anyway, Sundaramurti goes in. Shiva understands what's happening outside. Shiva asks Sundaramurti Nayanar to go to the assembly and apologize and then basically sing a song. So Sundaramurti Nayanar asks Shiva, okay, what do I sing? Right? And then Sundaramurti Nayanar comes to the assembly, apologizes, and he starts saying, Tillaivar Andanartham Adiyarkum Adiyen. Tillaivar is the Shivites living in Tillai, which is Chidambaram. I am a slave of the slaves of these Andanars, these Shivites. And from then on, he goes on to list all the Nayanmars, all the great saints of the Shivite tradition. So that is how the original poem, which is 10 stanzas worth, it was called Tirutondar Togai. Tirutondar is, Togai is a work, an account of all the bhaktas. Tondar is bhakta. So it says it's an account of the bhaktas of Shiva. And he goes on to narrate about all the Nayanmars, all the 60 Nayanmars. Later on, Sekkilhar also becomes one of the 63. He's also considered one of the Nayanmars. He narrates the stories of names and stories of all the Nayanmars before him. And finally, he says, I don't just stop with this. I also bow down to all the Nayanmars who may have been in other religions, other parts of the world, who have gone before us that we don't know of, who are yet to come that we don't know of. I bow in front of all of them. I bow before all of them. So that is the story behind the original 10 stanza work called Tiruttondar Togai, composed, just sung by Sundaramurthi Nayanar at the temple. Now we've got this poem, and then Sekkilhar, after hundreds of years of this happening, he's just got a poem and he's tasked with writing a book. He ends up writing a book, and that book narrates, expands and tells the stories of all the 63 Nayanmars. Now, one of the reasons why he decides to write about all the 63 and not stop with just one or two. He could have picked the two biggest, the three best, five best, or 10 best. And he could have written the stories of those 10 in very detailed versions, and that could have been an amazing novel, propounding Shaivism. But he did not stop with just sample testing. He wrote about all 63. Now, there is an interesting reason behind why. Now, he didn't mention that. It is others who have written commentaries who say this. There was once a Buddhist vihara, learning center of learning, where there was a senior priest, there was a junior, and there were other students learning. Now, it seems every day the senior would sit and meditate for a while on Buddha, and all of a sudden, one day there was a cat that was being reared in the vihara. It started coming and bothering him. It started troubling his dhyana. So he tries to silence it. He tries to shoo it away. It keeps troubling him. So he grabs the cat, ties it gently to a pole nearby, and he continues his meditation. Since then, every day, whenever he sits for meditation, the cat would come and start bothering him. So every day he would tie it up. One day, the senior Acharya passed away, and the junior became the new head of the institution. The first rule that he said was, before he sits for meditation, someone has to tie a cat to the pillar near it. Now, this is an interesting anecdote used to show how, if we do something, we become way too ritualistic and we lose the essence of it. The cat was being tied because meditation was being disturbed. Meditation was not being enabled because the cat was being tied. So there is this interesting logic of human psyche works in such a way that if you say, for example, bhakti is the only marga to attain moksha, then people will just stick to bhakti and they will not respect jnana. If you say jnana is the only way to attain moksha, people will just stick to jnana, they'll forget bhakti. So it is human psyche that if you say, okay, if you have to attain the God, if you have to attain God, if there is one way, and if there is one story and one example, people tend to accept that example as the universal truth and discount every other option available. And that's natural human tendency. Sekkilhar, when he thought about the Tiruttondar Togai and the stories of the Nayanmars, he didn't want to use three examples and show, okay, person A did this and this is how he met Shiva. Person B did this and this is how he attained Shiva. Person C did this and he attained Shiva. If he stops with one story, people will think that is the only way to attain Shiva and discount every other alternative. If he stops with 10, people will think there are only 10 ways to attain Shiva and they'll discount everything. In writing about all the 63 Nayanmars, his message to the people are, the way you have bhakti, if you be yourself and if you are very, very staunch in your bhakti, you can attain Shiva. It can be none of these 64 ways that have been that have been used. You can still attain Shiva Loka. You can attain Shiva. To attain Shiva, you need bhakti. Bhakti can be not necessarily in one way. It can be in any of these 63 ways. You choose your pick. And if you don't have any of these 63 and you have a 64th way, you will still succeed if your bhakti is true, and your yearning for Shiva is solid. That is why he writes a little bit about all the 63 and doesn't stop with 1 or 2 or 5 or 10 examples. Now, what I have done is picked only 5 examples to talk about. I think in the next 15-20 minutes, we'll try and talk about just 5 stories. Maybe for another day, we'll look at 5 more and 5 more and 5 more, and we'll potentially look at all 63. But for today, I've looked at 5 interesting stories. And there is a reason why I've picked these 5, which we will look at in the end. But there are 5 stories that I picked. One, I would want to go in detail, and the other 4, fairly brief, not into the detail, because each of these stories we could probably talk about for an hour each. Now, out of these 5 stories, 4 are actually of Shaivites mentioned by Sundaramurthi in the Tirutondar Togai. The 5th one is an interesting one. He is not part of the 63. He's outside the 63, but there's a very important reason. That's why Sekkilhar comes and plugs this person as well in it. So let's look at these 5 stories. The first story talks about a saint. So among the 63, there are 3 of them which are considered very, very important. One among the 3 is Tirujnana Sambandar. Tirujnana Sambandar. In short, he's called Sambandar. The story is when he was young, when he was 2 years old, Uma Parvati gave him and fed him her breast milk. And from then on, he got immense knowledge when he was as young as 2 years old. And he lived on till a ripe old age, and then he attained Mukti or Shivapada. Tirujnana Sambandar was someone who attained Shiva Jnana when he was just 2 years old. That is because Uma Parvati fed him her milk. There are Nayanmars who were brilliant at 2, 5, 7 years old. There are Nayanmars who were brilliant at 70, 80. They lived long as well. It's a combination of multiple stories. But Tirujnana Sambandar is one of the most important because he was directly fed by Uma and he attained Jnana at a very, very young age. Now, when he became an adult, as he was getting older, he would go from town to town to town, visit Shiva temples, and instantaneously sing songs praising Shiva. All these songs sung by these 63 Nayanmars, visiting from one temple to the other, they are together called Tevarams. Isha Foundation has come up with a beautiful set of 10 Tevarams, including the first one, the Tirutondar Togai, which talks about all the 63 Nayanmars. So I'll probably share the link later on. It's available on YouTube. Just type in Isha Tevaram. They have sung about 8 or 10 of the most popular Tevarams. These songs of these 63 Nayanmars together are called Tevarams. Now, Tirujnana Sambandar goes from town to town, village to village, Shiva temple to Shiva temple. He would stay in a chaultri or a chatra, eat food that he gets, whatever food, bathe in the river, worship Shiva, move on to the next village. So he would just do this all his life. He once goes to a place called Thirumarugul. Thirumarugul is a village in Tamil Nadu. He goes to worship the Shiva temple. There is a very famous Shiva temple there, maintained till date. He wants to go and visit, have a darshana of Shiva of Thirumarugul, and he's gone there. And the previous evening it's been late, so he couldn't go. He stays at the chaultri, at a chatram, travel pilgrims mantapa close to the temple. His idea is to get up early in the morning next day, bathe in the river, and have a darshana of the Shiva. In the same vicinity, in another chatram, stay a young couple. Now, these couple are people who have actually eloped from their houses. It seems a man had 7 daughters. One of their own relatives, a guy, wanted to marry the eldest daughter. He comes and asks for her hand in marriage. The father says, "Oh, no, I'm going to find someone else for her. We'll look at it. We'll look at the second daughter for you." So he kind of wants to avoid this relative. He somehow makes up excuses. He marries off 6 of their daughters to others. Now there is this last daughter, and this relative is very keen on marrying her. He comes and asks for her hand. The father makes up some excuses and he buys some time, and he immediately goes and tries to fix an engagement with someone else. Now, this youngest daughter, she's a little upset with the fact that her father has been cheating this nice, honest man for so many years, and 6 of her sisters are married. She wants to marry him and do the deal, as in fulfill the deal that her father had spoken about. But there is no chance. So she writes a letter to him, asks him to come out, and both of them elope. Where do they go to? They elope from their homes. They reach Tirumarugul. They are staying there, wanting to get married the next morning in front of Shiva. That night, looks like when they were sleeping, a snake bites that man and he dies. The next early in the morning, when she wakes up and she realizes her fiance is dead, she starts crying, wailing, hearts out, and she starts complaining to Shiva. She starts praying to Shiva to say, why did this happen to her? Tirunjana Sambandar, who went to the river, showered, came to his chatra to proceed to the temple, hears these voices from the neighboring hall. Unlike someone who would not care, someone whose only focus is on Shiva, he could have very easily ignored those cries and tried to avoid that route and gone to the Shiva temple, which is a normal practice. When you're going to a temple, you just don't see, a death. But Tirunjana Sambandar puts the pain of her above everything else. He goes and inquires what happened. She tells the story and she is crying, and the others tell the story of this couple and how he was killed by a snake. Tirunjana Sambandar asks people to carry his dead body, goes straight to the temple of Tirumarugul, in front of the Lord, outside the temple, places the body, and he composes a song. He sings to Shiva. He sings to Shiva about this wailing woman, how it has been so bad. And then he in between says, you Shiva of Tirumarugul, where ponds have beautiful lotuses blossoming, can you do something about this dead man? Now, the thing is, there is something called Stuti Ninda or Ninda Stuti. You can actually use sarcasm at the Lord. You can question and criticize and scold the Lord if you have that level of bhakti. It seems he was using this lotus and flower reference to say, Shiva, just by one sun shining bright, the lotuses that are actually kind of put with their heads down in the ponds, they all blossom because of the sun. Just if one sun can make a lotus blossom, how can you, who is equal to Koti Surya, millions of Shivas, in your temple town, how can you let this young girl become a widow even before she is married? How can you let her wither away in front of you? It seems he sings a song, and then the story is eventually Shiva gives the man the life back to the man, and then both of them actually get married. Now that's the first story of the 63. Now obviously, if I were to read out the Tamil verses, it's much more eloquent, poetic, beautiful, but we'll skip the Tamil renderings for the time being. But this is the story. Tirunjana Sambandar saving a man from death because that man's wife was an ardent Shiva Bhakta. That is the first story. Just a very minor deviation from here. Again, I have nothing against Buddhism, but not Buddhist as well. But one of the things about Buddha, a popular story that gets taught to us is there is a woman who's lost her child, goes running to Buddha and cries. Buddha by then had become Buddha. Gautama Siddhartha had become Buddha, the enlightened one. She goes and cries to him and says, my son is dead. I'm suffering, I'm in pain, do something. Buddha tells her, okay, I will give you a solution, but can you do one thing? Can you go to all the houses and find a house which has never seen death and bring a handful of mustard seeds? Sasive, bring a handful of mustard seeds. Now, the woman goes from house to house to house, asks for a handful of mustard seeds if there has never been a death in their family, and no house gives them mustard seeds. And then she comes back to Buddha and she realizes the reality of life and death. And it seems she goes back in sorrow. She accepts reality. Now, while that sounds catchy, I think the beauty of Tirunjana Sambandar and Shaivism is when someone is in pain, it is not the time to philosophize. Sometimes it is the need to be with the person in pain. Sometimes the need of the hour is to find a solution to that pain rather than saying pain is natural, pain is real, death is natural, who doesn't get death. It is very, very tricky if we were to start philosophizing when someone is in pain. And that is the difference between what Gautama Buddha did and Tirunjana Sambandar did. The second story is it is not one of the 63 Nayanmars. This story is not sung by Sundarar. It is not in 63. Whenever in ancient times someone composes a book, they will talk about the town, the city where the book is written, or the city where the stories in the book happen. For example, Kamban, who wrote the Tamil version of Ramayana. Valmiki has written the Sanskrita Ramayana, which is the Moola Ramayana, the original Ramayana. There is Sri Ramacharita in Brajabhasha. Valmiki is obviously in Sanskrit, and Kamban's is in Tamil. These are considered the three most famous and important works of Ramayana. Valmiki's Ramayana in Sanskrit, Tulasidasa's Ramacharita and Kamban's Ramayanam. In Kamba Ramayana, he spends a lot of time beautifully narrating Kosala, the kingdom. He narrates the city, the town, the kind of agricultural fields, the kind of animals and birds. So it is called Nagar Sirap, the beauty of a town or the beauty of a place. So whenever they compose any important work, they try to narrate a little bit about the surroundings of wherever these stories occur. Sekkilhar, in the name of writing Nagar Sirap, the beauty of a town, actually implants a beautiful story, though the story is not about one of the 63 Nayanmars. This hasn't been sung by Sundarar. The story is of a Chola king again called Manu Nidhi Kanda Solan. It's an amazing name. Kings those days used to actually have names based on the deeds that they have done. There used to be a king called Kochenganna Cholan, meaning a king with red eyes. He always had red eyes, and that's a beautiful story as well, probably for the next session. So Kochenganna Cholan was Chola with red eyes. Likewise, Manu Nidhi Kanda Solan means the king who upheld Manu's Dharma Shastra. Manu is considered Hinduism's first lawgiver, Dharma Shastra giver. This king upheld Manu's Nidhi. What is the story about Manu Nidhi Kanda Solan? It seems this Chola had installed a bell outside the palace. Anyone who had a grievance that had to be sorted could go and ring the bell, and the king and his ministers would attend to the problem. It seems one day a cow, when the king and the ministers were in Sabha, when they were discussing political matters, they heard the bell ringing, and they come out and they see a cow actually ringing the bell. Now the king is very surprised. He inquires about it, and he gets to know the cow actually takes the king. The cow starts walking, the king follows. It takes him to a calf which is dead in the middle of the road. The cow's own calf is lying dead in the middle of the road. The king is stunned. He doesn't know what happened. he asks his prime minister and his ministers on what happened. Now, the ministers and the passers-by say, the prince, king's son, the prince, who was on his rounds in the chariot, by mistake, the calf came on its own and fell under the chariot and it died. Now, the king says, oh, this is a problem. My son, the prince, has been responsible for the death of a calf which went under the wheels of his chariot, and the cow, the mother cow, has come and complained to me. Now, what is the justice that I need to give? I can't bring the calf back to life. What is the justice that I can give to this mother cow? He decides the same pain that the cow is experiencing with the passing of the calf should be experienced by me, who is the father of this prince who was responsible for the cow's pain. So what you do, get the prince to lie down, get the chariot, run it over him and kill the prince. Now, the prime minister and the ministers are absolutely stunned. They're like, is this even fair? It is an animal after all. Your son did not go fast. He was not rash. It was the calf that came and fell under the wheels, almost like it was a suicide. So they try to make up stories to defend, because this prince is the next king. He's the only son of the king, and his life is at stake. The ministers try to argue and whatnot. Finally, when the prime minister says, king, it's after all an animal. Why are you killing a human for this? The king asks a very important question. He says, how do you say this cow is just an animal? How would an animal know there is a bell for justice? And how would it know it has to come and ring? It has come to me expecting justice. If a cow can come to a king expecting justice, it is not a cow. It is as good as human. And I'm not going to just, swipe it away saying it's just an animal. He says, ministers, you guys are talking justice. I'm talking dharma. There is a difference between justice or law, and there is a difference between dharma and law. You're talking law. You're saying it's after all an animal, and how do you know what not? I'm talking about dharma. Dharma is, if my son has been responsible for the pain of the cow, I need to go through the same pain. He says, you have to do this. The prime minister actually suffers a heart attack, falls dead there. The prime minister realizes the magnitude of it. He says, how can I be responsible for running a chariot over a prince? But the king's right. He's so valid in his understanding of dharma. So he just falls dead. He actually suffers a heart attack. The king then says, okay, so what if the minister is dead? I will satisfy justice. I will deliver justice. He gets on the chariot. His son is willingly lying down on the road. The king runs the chariot, kills the son. It is when the son is dead that Shiva appears in front of the king. Shiva praises the king, and then he brings the calf back to life, brings the son back to life, and brings the minister back to life. This is what dharma can do. If we follow dharma, the gods come to us, is the moral of this, the niti of the story. Anyway, there's also an interesting fact about why Sekkilhar mentions the order in which they were revived. First the calf was revived, then the son was revived, then the minister was revived. What if the minister was revived first? He would have seen the calf dead, the son dead. The grief would have hit him saying, oh, the king has killed the son. He would have died again. What if the son was brought up first? Then the king would have seen, oh, the son is alive, the calf is still dead. Let me get the chariot over the son once again. There is very, very nuanced ways of how our dharma plays out, which is why first the calf was brought back, the son was brought back, the calf was brought back. When the son was brought back, the king was happy. When the minister was brought back, he saw all of them alive, so he was happy. This is a story of Manunidi Kanda Solan, who delivered justice to an animal. Now, the third and the fourth stories, I'll make it fairly short because the third story is very popular. The fourth story, it's actually very simple. It's not a very detailed story. But these two are, again, in the Shiva Puranas, right? In the Shivaite Puranas. The third story is about Shibi Chakravarti. Most of us would have heard about Shibi Chakravarti. He was seen as one of the most generous kings India has ever seen. And Indra and Agni Deva and Devendra wanted to test the kind heart, the graciousness of this king. So Agni takes the form of a pigeon, Indra takes the form of a Garuda, vulture or Garuda, and the king is in his palace, sitting with his head priest and whoever. The pigeon comes flying. It sits at the windowsill of the king. It comes into his lap and it actually talks. It tells the king, a Garuda is chasing, a vulture is chasing her, and she needs abhaya, protection from the king. The king says, okay, I will protect you. And then soon after, the vulture comes, and the vulture complains to the king and says, this is not fair. Okay, you want to protect the pigeon because you've given her the word, but how can you deny natural selection, nature? It is nature that vultures eat smaller birds. You can't change the nature in the name of protecting someone. I'm hungry now, and if I don't eat this bird, I'm going to end up dead. I'm going to be responsible for my death. So Shibi now decides to do something interesting. He tells the vulture, okay, if you're hungry and if I need to save your life, it is very simple. I will give you my own flesh. Please eat and satisfy your hunger. Now, the vulture says the flesh that you give should be equal to the weight of the pigeon. So they bring a scale. They put the pigeon on one side. He cuts away a part of his thigh, flesh from his thigh. He places it on the other side. The pigeon is still heavier. He takes some more flesh, places it. It doesn't even tilt. The scale is still heavily in favor of pigeon. Finally, the king says, okay, I may have to sacrifice my own whole life. So he sits on the scale, and then they become equal. Then Agni Deva and Indra Deva present before the king and say, we were just testing to what extent you can go to protect someone who sought your protection, and then how much of a grace you have. So this is a story of a king willing to sacrifice his own life to save the life of a pigeon. The next one is interesting. This is coming from this story comes from the Sangam era of the Tamil literature. The Sangam era is before Common Era, about 3,000 years old now, 3,500 years old now. During the Sangam era, there is a king called Vel Pari. Let's just call him Pari. Pari was a king who once was going on a chariot. It was a hot day. He was going hunting. He stopped the chariot, saw a lake, went to the lake, drank the water from there, and rested for a while, and came back to his chariot. When he came back to his chariot, he saw a creeper had already grown. I mean, it had not grown at that time, but it had fallen on, or it had taken the support of the wheel of the chariot, and it had climbed up a little bit. He saw that. He realized, oh, even plants have life, even creepers have life. If nature has given me water without me asking for it, as in without any asking, giving, if nature has been giving whatever I want, how can I take the life of a creeper? Let me give the life of the creeper to itself. I'm not going to take the chariot. He leaves the chariot there and he goes walking back to the kingdom till his soldiers come and looking for him. Now, again, the story may sound superficial, and we'll talk about why it is not superficial in a very short while. But here was a king who gave up his chariot, walked all the way back because he didn't want to destroy the life of a creeper. And the last story, and I think probably it may take about 10, 12 minutes, but this is the most fascinating of the stories. again, story that we all know, but story that should be seen from a slightly different light. Story with some interesting facts is a story of Kannappa Nayanar. It is interesting. In Kannada literature as well, we worship Bedara Kannappa. We worship the story, we celebrate the story of Bedara Kannappa. Bedara Kannappa is considered one of the 63 Nayanmars. In Sekkilhar, in Sundaramurthi Nayanar's original, the 10-paragraph poem, he writes only one line about Kannappa, Bedara Kannappa. He says, Kalaimalinda Seernambi Kannappar Adiyen. I am a slave, Adiyen, of Kannappa, who was the most literate in the world, the most educated in the world. Now, that is what Sundaramurthi Nayanar writes. Based on that, Sekkilhar understands and finds out the story, and then he writes in detail. Now, the story of Kannappa is known, but we'll talk about it again, right? Kannappa is born in a tribal clan. His father and mother are the chief tribal leaders of that tribe. They live in a forest at Srikalahasti in today's Andhra Pradesh. And the Kannappa and one of his best friends, they go hunting every day and they bring in animals and they eat, right? So one day, Kannappa and his friend go on a wild boar hunt, wild boar hunt. They hunt a wild boar, and the Kannappa brings the boar. The boar is dead. He asks his friend to chop the boar into pieces, light a fire, and cook so they both can eat and then go back home. He says, I'll go and wash my hands and legs and I'll bring some water as well. He goes a little far in search of water. He sees a river, and that river is called Pon Mugali. Pon is golden, Mugali is the name of the river. There is a river called Pon Mugali river flowing there. The moment he puts his hand in the river and his feet in the river, he feels an electric shock. He feels something abnormal. Kannappa Nayanar. He says, there's something about this river. He comes running to the friend and he asks his friend, who is slightly elder to him, what is the story? I went to the river to take some water. It looks amazing. Something happened to me. The feeling was blissful. I can't make out what it is. Do you know something about it? The friend, who's a little elder, says, oh, I've heard about it. I also heard your father telling me about this. It seems beyond the river, there is a mountain that you see there. On top of that mountain, there is a Shiva. There is a temple there, and I've seen your father and mother go and worship there sometimes. There is a temple there. I don't know. There is some priest that come. I don't know what's there, but maybe it's the power of that temple. Now, Kannappa Nayanar gets curious to find more. He asks his friend to prepare the boar. He has bows and arrows. He's got the long jata. He crosses the river, climbs the small peak, gets on top. He sees a Shivalinga there. Something happens to him that he suddenly just falls in love with Shiva there, the Shivalinga there. He doesn't know it is Shiva. He doesn't know it's a Shivalinga. It's just a stone. He's never heard of a god before that. But the moment he sees Shivalinga, he is taken over by bhakti and he falls in love with Shivalinga. He goes close to Shivalinga. He takes a look. He hugs Shiva. Something unnatural, abnormal takes him over. He hugs Shiva. He starts, cuddling it and talking in very, very lovey tones to Shivalinga. And then his friend follows him up. He asks his friend, what is this? He says, oh, I don't know. They say it is some Shiva. And I've seen one pujari. I've heard one pujari comes and prays. So because Kannappa also sees some flowers on top of Shiva, a garland on top of Shivalinga. There is Pongal, what do you call it? There is Naivedya, Prasada for gods placed in front. And he sees all of this. And the friend says, there is some pujari who comes and does all this, but I don't understand what this is. Kannappa tastes some of the food. It is tasteless. He looks at the flower, not very great. What he does, he gets an idea. He runs all the way down. gets the pork meat that his friend has cooked. He tastes it in his mouth to check whether it is not chewy and it is not half cooked. He tastes every single piece. He takes a leaf. He spits the pieces that are good. He spits out the pieces that are not good. The pieces that are good, he spits in the leaf, takes it. Now he says, oh, you said that Pujari does water abhisheka. He goes to the river. There is no container for him to carry water. He actually takes a handful of water, fills it in his mouth. He plucks some wild flowers, puts it in his hair, because there is one hand he's got his weapons, the other hand he's got the cooked pork. He puts the flowers on his head, climbs the hill again, goes there. Now his hands are full. He needs to clean the place. He uses his feet to clean the flowers of Shiva's head on top of Shivalinga. He uses his legs to clean it up. Then he spits the water from his mouth in the form of Abhisheka, takes the flowers from his head and puts it on Shiva's head, throws away the pongal that the pujari had placed, keeps the pork meat in front of Shiva. And he gets an unusual feeling of love and affection and bhakti towards Shiva. He feels that. He does this. He says, okay, I'll come tomorrow. And he and his friends climb down. The pujari comes the next morning. He's absolutely awestruck. He's panicking. He's in pain. He's angry. He says, who has done this distortion to Shiva? He brings water, cleans it up, does the punya havachana, cleans up the whole place. Then once again puts his garland, leaves his prasada, and he goes. Bedara Kannappa comes the next day, does the same thing, cleans this, leaves meat with his water and his flowers. Third day, the same thing happens. Fourth day, the same thing happens. Fifth day, the same thing happens. Finally, the sixth day, the Shivacharya who does the puja, he is very, very anguished. And then he tells Shiva, Shiva, I don't know who is doing this to you. They are insulting you. They are tarnishing you. Please do something about it. And the Shivacharya goes. That night, Shiva appears in the dream of Shivacharya. He tells the Shivacharya, tomorrow you come up, you wake up in the morning, you come to my Sannidhana. Don't come in the front, hide somewhere. There is a guy called Kannappa who comes to see me every day. There is a guy, I don't know whatever his tribal name was. He comes to do this to me every day. I actually love his affection and his bhakti and his way of worship. You come and take a look at it. Now, why did Shiva go to the Shivacharya and why did Shiva not go to Kannappa? Is a knot that we will untangle some other day. It should have been Shiva should go to Kannappa and say, you come tomorrow, you hide and see. There is a Shivacharya who does worship. He does a particular padhati. You look at it, you learn from it, you follow it. Shiva could have done that, but he doesn't do that. He goes to the Shivacharya and tells. But it doesn't mean the Shivacharya was any less. He was very, very strong about his own methods and he stuck to it. Even if Shiva says he likes the treatment that Kannappa gives him, the Shivacharya did not stop. He would still do his method. It is important to stick to our own methods, no matter what someone else says their methods are better in terms of bhakti, in matters of bhakti. So Shivacharya comes the next morning, hides. He sees Kannappa come. He sees all this. Now, just when Kannappa is about to turn back and go, Shiva's right eye starts bleeding. Kannappa is very angry. He is crying. He doesn't know what to do. He questions Shiva. He asks why this has happened. He doesn't know what to do. He's panicking. He's shouting. And then he realizes in the tribal system, if you lose a part of the body, you try to replace the same part with something else. Kannige kannu, they say, an eye for an eye. So he says, okay, if Shiva's eye is what is hurt, maybe if I put my eye on Shiva's eye, it will heal. So without a moment's thought, he takes his arrow, pierces his right eye, puts it in Shiva's right eye, the bleeding stops. Kannappa is happy. He hugs Shiva. He says, it's okay, you are healed. Thanks, my tribal knowledge worked. Let's do this. And then, after a minute, Shiva's left eye starts dripping blood, tears of blood. Kannappa is now again angry, unhappy, upset. He says, okay, it's very simple. If my right eye has fixed your right eye, my left eye will fix your left eye. But how do I know if my eyes are gouged out? How do I know where your left eye is? He raises his feet, puts his thumb of the feet in the place where Shiva's left eye is. He goes on to pierce his left eye. Shiva comes, stops him, appears in front of him, and gives him moksha. He gives him mukti. It is said Shiva took Kannappa away with him. Shiva then calls him Kannappa. In Tamil, Appa is not Tande Appa. It also means father, but upper means, appadal means to stick. Upper means the one who stuck his eye at Shiva. So Kannappar, Shiva called him Kannappa, and he restored both the eyes of Kannappa. Now, another interesting nuance here is, it is very silly of Shiva to test Kannappa to the extreme. Okay, if someone's given his right eye, what's the big deal? Why should you test him again with your left eye? Do you not trust him? Do you still not think, do you still not understand his bhakti? If he's willing to give his right eye to you, he will be willing to give his left eye to you. Why do you have to test? Now, a couple of our elders have a very, very interesting analogy to it. They say, when Shiva's right eye was bleeding, Shiva saw Kannappa through his left eye, and then Kannappa gave his eye to Shiva. Now the right eye was fine, the left eye was bleeding. Now Shiva's original left eye is bleeding. Whose eye is Shiva using to see Kannappa? It is Kannappa's own eye. They say, it's an interesting take. Even for Shiva to understand Kannappa's depth of bhakti, he had to see Kannappa's bhakti through his own eyes to understand how deep it is. Even from Shiva's eyes, he couldn't understand the real depth of Kannappa's bhakti. It is when the left eye was bleeding and the right eye was Kannappa's, and when Shiva saw Kannappa through his own eyes, through Kannappa's eyes, he understood how deep the bhakti was, and that's when he stopped Kannappa from plucking his second eye. And that goes the story. Now, Kannappa hasn't gone to school, has no basic education, hasn't read the Shiva Agamas, nothing. And Sundaramurthi Nayanar says, Kalai Malinda Seermalli Seernambi Kannappar Kadiyen. Sundaramurthi Nayanar, in his original poem, says, I bow down in front of Kannappa, who is the most literate. Now, how does Sekkilhar reconcile these two? Kannappa is an absolute illiterate who doesn't have any knowledge of the world as an educated world. But Sundaramurthi Nayanar calls him the most literate person in the world. Now, Sekkilhar writes something very, very beautiful, and it's apt to probably stop with this final thing. The starting block of our human evolution in an individual life is literacy, education. Literacy or education, not necessarily both. Education, literacy. If one becomes literate, they don't stop with literacy or education. They evolve to wisdom. Your literacy should lead you to wisdom, knowing what is right, wrong, the ability to discern, this is right, this is wrong. If someone is peaking at wisdom, they won't stop at wisdom, they'll go to discipline. Okay, I know what is right, I know what is wrong, but I will always stick to right, no matter what the external circumstances are. I will never touch wrong, no matter what the external circumstances are. Literacy should lead you to wisdom. Wisdom should lead you to discipline. Discipline should lead you to love. If you are just rigidly disciplined and say very, very rude and rigid and orthodox, if there is no love, that discipline is useless. Discipline, unless it matures into love, is useless. Now, what is the highest of love? It is what is called Arul in Tamil. There is no like for like translation in English, unfortunately. But the nearest word is grace. Your love should become grace. What is the difference between love and grace? Love is when you show affection to someone who's done something good to you. Grace is something when you show affection to someone who you don't even know, haven't even seen them, haven't even heard about them. That is grace. Kannappa had grace. Because Kannappa had grace, it means he had love. Because without love, there can't be grace. Because he had love, it means he had discipline. Because without discipline, there is no love. Because he had discipline, it means he had wisdom. Because without wisdom, he couldn't have gone to discipline. And when will you have wisdom? When you have education. It doesn't matter if he's not gone to school. In his previous Janma, he would have attained all of that. And in this Janma, he's already full of grace. And when he displayed that grace to Shiva, he attained Mukti. Which is why Sundaramurthi Nayanar says he's the most educated. Because he's attained all the levels in that cycle or in that ladder, which starts from education. Which is why he's the most educated, the most literate of all the Shiva Bhaktas, he says. One final comment on why I chose those 5 stories. There are 5 levels of grace. Your grace to someone that you don't know. You can do good to someone who you know, who is connected to you, your family, your friends, your relatives, your colleagues. You can do good to a random stranger. These 5 stories talk of 5 random acts of kindness, love to strangers. The first one of Tirunjana Sambandar was man showing his love for co-man to another human being, to a girl who was crying, who was in sorrow, to a woman who was in sorrow. The second step, there was the story of Manunidi Kanda Solan. He went one step higher, showed kindness towards an animal. It's not even a human, it's a cow that he showed his kindness towards. The third story of Sibi Chakravarti, not even to an animal, to a bird which has less IQ than animals, which has less senses than animals. He showed love to a bird that had come to his protection. So there was man showing love to man showing love to animal, man showing love to a bird. A creeper. Plants are probably the lowest in the cycle, but plants still show love. Plants bloom, they blossom. Plants do react as well. And plants have feelings of happiness and sorrow. The Pari, who actually gave away his chariot to a creeper, showed love to a creeper. Man shows love to man. Man shows love to animals. Man shows love to birds. Man shows love to creepers, which is all fine because creepers will reflect your love. Birds will reflect your love. Animals will reflect your love. People can reflect your love. But the one thing that will not reflect any love is a piece of stone. Kannappa did not know Shiva. Kannappa did not understand Agamas. Kannappa did not know any of the Bhakti Vidhanas. When he saw a stone, and because he was attracted by it, he showed that love. Something that can't give you anything, just to show your love for a stone that is bleeding, is seen as the highest form of bhakti possible. And that is what connects these 5. And that's why these 5 stories are the most important. There are stories of bravery, there are stories of sacrifice, selflessness. There are another 55 stories that we could go on. But these 5 stories are good examples of how love becomes grace from man to animal to bird to creepers to even stones. And that is an introduction, probably a drop in the ocean called Periya Puranam. And like I said, none of it is of my own. None of these stories are created or narrated or modified by me. Everything is things that I've learned from others, read, heard, upanyasams. Ilangai Jayaraj is a very, very popular speaker in the Shivaite tradition today. He lives in Sri Lanka. He's called Ilangai Jayaraj. He speaks beautifully in Tamil. And most of it is knowledge or things that I've learned from listening to his speeches. So again, I claim nothing of these, apart from the fact that these are amazing stories that have captivated me, and I thought it is worth sharing it with others as well. So with that, once again, உலகம் யாவையும் தாம் உளவாக்கலும் நிலை பெறுத்தலும் நீக்கலும் நீங்களா அழகிலா விளையாட்டுடையார் அவர் தலைவர் அன்னவர்க்கே சரண் நாங்களே. I think that is the end of this discourse, and we can open it to questions if you have any questions.
It was indeed a good session, sir. For those who don't understand Tamil, but is still willing to listen to all those stories and learn from them, it's indeed a very good initiative.
Thank you very, very much. I think it's interesting because the Tamil that it is written in, I don't understand that Tamil as well because it's written in ancient Tamil. But I think the stories and the essence is just beautiful. And if you understand little bits of Tamil, it will be much more relevant. But I think still the essence is there.
Yes, sir.
Thank you very much for your time. You have a nice evening and we'll see some other time.
Sure. Thank you, sir.
Thank you. Thank you.